This noble creature, who is made in the image and likeness of his Maker, demonstrates that he has received the dignity worthy of this ancient honour, and that even now he is effecting recovery. It is effecting recovery when he considers it unworthy of himself to conform to this passing world. So the first stage in the process is that he thinks that he doesn't have to conform to the way everybody else thinks, that just the thought is the beginning. He aims rather at being reformed, according to St. Paul's teaching, in a newness of understanding, and in that same likeness according to which he confesses that he was made. In this way, he duly forces the world to be conformed to him, for whose sake it was made. Instead of his being conformed to the world, he creates a Christian environment around him. He begins to change the world, and it's a rather important sentence here for some other aspects of Bernard's social teaching that we won't go into. By such a marvellous reversal, admirabile commercium, the theme of exchange, all things begin to work together unto good in their proper and natural form without any deviance, because they acknowledge as their Lord him in whose service they were created. And again, the likeness to St. Paul's teaching in Romans is very close. Remember in 1:21 and the following of Romans, St. Paul says, because they knew God and didn't acknowledge him or render him thanks, then the following things happen. He sketches out the whole path of decline. And here he's saying the opposite, that because they acknowledge God and confess him as their Lord, then things start to get better, even in the physical world. And so it's the fact that there are people able to live a truly spiritual life on earth which demonstrates the heavenly origin of the human spirit. Punning between the likeness of Chelebs and Chelum. In other words, that a celibate is one who is related to heaven. Chelebs, celibate, and Chelum. Bernard cites celibacy as manifest proofs of man's otherworldly or heavenly origins and capacity. So he's saying, if celibacy is possible, then anything's possible. If celibacy is possible, then it means that man is more than simply a beast. If one is able to remain celibate, then one must have a heavenly origin. And for Bernard, to have a heavenly origin means that we have a heavenly nature and a heavenly destiny. So let's just read this text from 27:6. There is no more manifest pointer to a heavenly origin than maintaining one's inborn likeness, even in the region of unlikeness, than the glory of the celibate life being lived on earth by an exile, than one living as an angel in a body which is almost that of the beasts. These things derive from heavenly, not from earthly power. They are an indication that the soul which is capable of them truly has its origins in heaven. So the fact that there are people that can live this sort of life shows that human beings as a whole are not merely products of social forces and instinctual forces, but are able to transcend instinctual and social forces, to live a life based on, you might say, spiritual priorities. And we'll just work through this and see where we get. Granted the innate capacity to become a heaven, it devolves upon human beings to give their assent to the Godward movement of their being. So all we have to say is say yes to this movement, this fundamental orientation of our being. And this not only in the abstract, but also in the day-to-day decisions of ordinary living. One who adds his will to furthering this movement becomes, as it were, an island of heaven in a hostile sea. I think that every soul of this sort can rightly be called heavenly, or even heaven, not only because of its origin, but also because it imitates the heavenly way of life. It is this that clearly demonstrates that its origin is really from heaven, when its way of life is heavenly. Therefore, a holy soul is itself a heaven. Its sun is understanding, its moon is faith, and its virtues are the stars. just a little simple way of talking about the spiritual nature of the human being. If it is true that humankind is made for union with God through love, then this must be the ultimate goal of all its questing. To the extent that this is attained, all is fulfilled. To the extent that it is frustrated, all is lost. And so the doctrine of man's imagehood has therefore as its corollary that human desire is absurd unless it leads to love. So, would you like to read our next text for us? Yeah.
Having taken food and drink, all that remains for the sick man is that he should rest in the quiet of contemplation after the sweat of activity. And while he thus dozes in contemplation, God appears, not directly, but obscurely, as in a mirror. This is because during this life God is not seen face to face. He is glimpsed rather than observed, and even that very briefly, like a quickly passing spark of light. But even such a rapid contact causes the soul to catch fire with love and say, "My soul has desired you in the night time, as has my spirit within me." It is appropriate that the friend of the bridegroom, and necessary for the faithful and prudent servant whom the Lord has appointed over his household, to burn with this love. Such a love fills and grows hot and boils, and then safely expands and overflows. For love is the fullness both of the law and of the heart, at least if it be perfect love. For God is love, and there is nothing in all created things which is able to fill the creature who has been made to God's image, except the love which is God, for he alone is greater than man.
So this is a very powerful statement of just so many Bernardine themes that it's almost like a meeting point of several different ideas. He begins with the idea that we're all sick. You're sick, but not necessarily on our last legs, because we can recover our health, we can regain our health through eating. We're sick and weak, and we're not able to make much progress, but what we really need is a good food. So having taken food and drink, what else do you need for recovery? All that remains for the sick man is a bit of a snooze. Go to sleep for a while. Is that he should rest in the quiet of contemplation. So he sees our taking on the Word of God, our ruminating on it, our chewing it over and digesting God's Word as part of the recovery. And this leads us to another curative exercise, which is the exercise of contemplation, sleeping, as it were. And while he dozes in contemplation, God appears, not directly, but obscurely, as in a mirror. So in line with all the great teachings, we don't see God perfectly, but we see glimpses of the divinity. Rara hora et parva mora. I can't translate that one. The hour it's only sometimes, and it doesn't last long. Rara ora et parva mora. It's a rare that it happens, and it only lasts a moment. But God does make an appearance. We suddenly find ourselves coming alive to a range of things that perhaps doesn't normally touch us. This is because during this life God is not seen face to face. He is glimpsed rather than observed, and even that very briefly, like a quickly passing spark of light. But even such a rapid contact causes the soul to catch fire with love. Later we might have a chance to look at Sermon 74. He says, how do you know when God visits the soul? And he says, I know when God has visited the soul because I wake up. You know, there's something there that touches me. I feel more alive. And you see, this is wholly in line with Bernard's anthropology, that the totality of our life is realized in union with God. So that when God manifests himself to us in this life, then automatically we become more alive, more human, and more loving. That because this is the mark of God, this is the smell of the apple that remains after even the briefest of his visit, that we ourselves are more alive, we are more human, we are more loving, and we catch fire with love. And so in Bernard's theology, after the meal you have the rumination, and after the rumination you have the belch, the eructatio. And so the good word which has come in the food goes back to God. The words that we've read in Scripture are no longer just words in a book, but they come forth from the heart as a belch. Psalm 44:1, remember in the old Latin, eructavit cor meum verbum bonum. My heart has belched forth a good word. So for Bernard, you eat the food, you ruminate it, you digest it, and then a spiritus or a wind grows up inside and carries the word back to God. My heart belches out a good word. So here we have an example of this. My soul has desired you in the night time, as has my spirit within me. The word which we previously read has become embedded in our hearts, and from our hearts it reaches out to make more contact with God. And so he's saying, okay, God visits us and we come alive. And so it's necessary that the friend of the bridegroom, it's appropriate that the friend of the bridegroom, and necessary for the faithful and prudent servant whom the Lord has appointed over his household, to burn with this love. When we were talking about the images of desire, we said that one of the most important for Bernard was the heat image, to burn with this love. Such a love fills and grows hot and boils and then safely expands and overflows. So if you're thinking of boiling up some coffee or boiling up some water or preferably some sort of food that does that sort of thing, that it fills and grows hot and boils and expands and then flows over. And that's the type of thing that he sees love as. Now here we have one of the most brilliant sentences that St. Bernard ever wrote. It's a good example of his style. For love is the fullness both of the law and what would we expect him to say? Prophets. That's what St. Paul says, the law. But he doesn't say that. He says this, love is the fullness both of the law and the heart. And what he's saying is very beautiful. That if we have love, then all external obligations will be met. I mean, that's what St. Paul says too. But Bernard goes forth and says that all our inner aspirations will also be met. If you only have love, love is not only the fullness of the law, but it's also the fullness of the heart. Everything that I desire, every human aspiration, every human desire is satisfied and fed simultaneously by love. And the experience of love and allowing ourselves to be shaped by love makes us more human, allows us to live from the heart. And so he's saying, how do you find this love? This love comes from the divine visitation. But when it comes, it begins to transform us so that our life gets into shape, we get our act together. Love does this. Love is the agent that makes us conform to all the requirements of the law, and at the same time it is the expression of all that our heart desires, all the things that make us discontented, all the things that make us reach for the Kleenex and say, if only I had such and such, then I'd be happy. What we're really saying in all these things is that I'm underloved, and that if I'm loved, I don't really care about anything else. But these other things that I desire become important if I don't have the experience of being loved and of loving in return. With love, nothing else matters. You're caught in the rain, it doesn't matter. Maybe in Canada it does. You get rheumatic fever or something. But generally, I mean, even disasters, if you're with someone that you love, they become good experiences, something to remember afterwards. Whereas if you're by yourself and you're unloved or underloved, then even good things don't have much taste. And this is what he's saying. Love is the fullness both of the law, all our external, all the regulations, the code of canon law, constitutions, house customs, all these things, the 10 Commandments, if you can remember them. All these things are fulfilled. You don't have to worry about that anymore. But also it gives a great sense of completion and happiness to the human being. As I say, it's one of the most extraordinary sentences that Bernard wrote. Just the way he builds us up always. I said this in the introduction, how you think you know what he's going to say, and then he just reverses course. For love is the fullness both of the law and the, every 10-cent demagogue in the history of Christianity has come out with love as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Bernard just changes it a little bit different. We think we know what he's going to say, and he slips something completely different and very, very profound. It's a fullness both of the law and the heart. All our external obligations are fulfilled by love, and at the same time everything that we desire of this life is fulfilled if we experience love. And think back on your own experience on that. When you experience love, nothing else matters. Even disasters only add piquancy and spice to the whole affair. For love is the fullness both of the law and of the heart, at least if it be perfect love. For God is love, and there is nothing in all created things which is able to fill the creature which has been made to God's image except the love which is God. In other words, that we are made with a hole in the middle, like some of Henry Moore's sculptures. And that hole can only be filled by love. You can keep pouring in everything else that you can find, but it won't fill it in. It'll just flow through. But we've been made for love, first of all, but secondly, there's only one type of love that can specifically fill us, and that's that all-embracing, that all-filling putty of the love of God. That can fill the gap within us. For God is love, and there is nothing in all created things which is able to fill the creature who has been made in God's image except the love which is God. For he alone is greater than man. We've been made with a great, great, great big hole. Remember we said the soul was cavernous. It was a huge thing, a huge void waiting to receive God. And nothing else can fill it. And this is where you've got to say, is Bernard speaking the truth? And again, well, the answer is interrogate your own experience. Look at all your other loves and say, are they able really to fill you? Maybe for a moment, maybe for a time, but are they really able to bring you this kind of fullness for which the human being is created? If Bernard is correct, the answer should be no. But only you can answer that question. I can't answer it for you. Okay, the experience of love is twofold. On the one hand, it is to strain after infinite love. On the other, it is the harnessing of all the energies of one's being under the aegis of the will. This is the ordinatio caritatis, right? The experience of love is the result of the bonding together of divine and human wills, an outcome already prefigured in creation, but only brought about by the graced assent of the will. So it can only happen that God's love fills us if we say yes. And Bernard is a voluntarist. Everything depends on the will. Everything depends on our saying yes to the offer which God makes us through his grace. Such conformity marries the soul to the Word, achieves the perfect union, as Bernard says, without much delicacy at times, between the soul and the Word. Such conformity marries the soul to the Word. Perfectly to love is to be married. And thus the culmination of the image theme and the high point in Bernard's use of the traditional theme of spiritual marriage. This is treated at great length in Bernard's 83rd sermon on the Song of Songs, written at the very end of his life. Some extracts follow. Okay, how are we off for volunteers? Would you like to read some more?
Such conformity marries the soul to the Word. The one who is like him by nature now shows itself like him by an act of the will, loving in the same way as it is itself loved. Therefore, if it perfectly loves, it has been married. What can be a source of greater pleasure than such a close union of wills? What can be more desirable than the love by which you, O soul, are not satisfied with human teaching, but go directly to the Word, remaining joined to the Word, familiarly relating and discussing whatever falls within the mind's grasp and the range of bold desire. Such a soul has really entered into a spiritual and holy contract of marriage. Instead of contract, I should perhaps say contact, since there is certainly question of a close embrace. When two will the same things and reject the same things, they become one spirit.
So, the great text that they all use, that he who adheres to God becomes one spirit with him, the unus spiritus. The object of all striving as regards the spiritual life is simply this, to become identified on the spiritual level with the Word, to become one spirit. And so Bernard says, well, how do you do this? How does it come about? And he says it quite simply. When two will the same things and reject the same things, they become one spirit. It's through our consent to the teaching of Christ about how we live and the things that are valuable, which are to be maintained and which are to be rejected. But it's all something that operates, not at a kind of, as he says, it's not a contractual sort of thing. It's something that comes about through contact. The more we move towards Christ, the closer we are, then the more we begin to have the same values and the same attitudes and the same priorities. And this very sameness causes us to become progressively one spirit. And so the image of love, of the Word, marriage with the Word, and so forth. Okay, next one.
Love is its own merit and reward. It seeks no justification beyond itself, nor any fruit external to itself. For the act of love is itself fruition. I love because I love. I love in order to receive love. Love is a great thing, on condition that it flows back to its own beginnings, returns to its origins, and draws from its sources the means by which it may permanently flow. When God loves, he wishes for nothing more than to be loved in return. He loves for no other purpose than to be loved, knowing that those who love him will be made happy in their very experience of such love.
Again, we've got to say, the danger here, we just hear love, 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 blah, 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 blah. And we don't really see, or we say, oh, wonderful words, Helen Steiner Rice, beautiful thoughts for a special occasion. And we don't really believe that he's got something to say. And this is where it's necessary to get out our pens and just sit down and say, now, what is he actually saying? Is he just waffling on because he was paid by the lion, or does he actually have something to say? Okay, I think he has something to say, and we can learn from him. Love is its own merit and reward. The whole test of love is if you do something out of love, you don't expect anything else. If you bake a cake out of love, it's the baking of the cake which is important, not whether it turns out well, not whether you get rewarded for it, not whether people say what a wonderful cook you are. But if something which is done out of love is its own merit and reward, it seeks no justification beyond itself, nor any fruit external to itself. It just as he says, I love because I love. It doesn't need to explain to itself why it's doing these things. It develops a whole instinct for what is right, or what's appropriate. For the act of love is itself fruition. Fruition means bringing to fruit, but in Latin particularly, it means enjoyment. The act of self is the act of love. He's saying is so enjoyable that you don't need to have a reason for it, because it explains itself. The act of love is itself fruition. I love because I love. I love in order to receive love. And anything that is done in love, a giving of a glass of cold water or something, gets a whole new quality about it. And it becomes a pleasurable thing. And an act that could otherwise be unpleasurable, like doing the dishes or driving down to meet somebody at the station, becomes pleasurable. If it's an act of love, because it's somebody that you want to meet, it's somebody that you love, then driving down to meet them at the station and driving them back doesn't need any reason, it doesn't need any justification, it doesn't need any goading or nagging to go and do it, but you just simply do it because it's enjoyment of itself. Even a very, very sort of basic level like that. Whereas if it's somebody we don't love, you have to be nagged to go and pick them up at the station. You think of excuses. Why can't they go to the bus? Or why can't they get a taxi? Or what's wrong? Who's afraid of a bit of snow? And all this kind of thing. But with love, if it's an act of love or an act that leads to love or is inspired by love, it needs no press releases or no justifications at all. I love because I love. When I do an act out of love, it's self-evident. We had Rana's autobiography read in our refectory. It was a marvellous little book, a television interview, but one of his favourite words is self-evident. The interviewer would say, and what about such and such? And he'd say, well, it's really self-evident. Apparently, a lot of things are self-evident to Rana, which aren't self-evident to the rest of us. But when we love, you know, why did you do that? Well, it's self-evident. It was love itself that makes us do these things. Love is a great thing, on condition that it flows back to its own beginnings. Love, they use the word love in tennis. And love is like a game of tennis because unless two play, it's a pretty miserable affair. Unless there is reciprocity in love, it doesn't really work. That's why narcissism is so defeating. You hold the thing up to the mirror and you're not getting anything back. That's why loving pop stars, I apologise if there are any present, is so self-defeating, because you love the people in the image, in the television tube, but you never get any love back. You can love fantasies, but you never get anything back. And so the essential part of love is kind of reciprocity. And who would want to you know, even the kind of chivalric love of the 12th century, presumably it never reached fruition. But the whole thing was trying to make it reciprocal, to enjoy the coming back of love from the other person. So he says love is a great thing on condition that it flows back to its own beginnings. There is real reciprocity. We've received love from God, but it will only, that experience will only be complete if we give that love, if we reciprocate that love. Love is a great thing on condition that it flows back to its own beginnings, returns to its origins, and draws from its sources the means by which it may permanently flow. When God loves, he wishes for nothing more than to be loved in return. And so the love of God, which is the cause of love in us, doesn't want us to do things for him, but fundamentally just wants us to learn to love him. The other things will look after themselves. He loves for no other purpose than to be loved, knowing that those who love him will be made happy in their very experience of such love. That love makes us happy. even in grisly kind of situations, we're still happy if we can love. Okay, the final text. Ken, would you like to read that for us?
Rightly does the bride renounce all other affections in order to give herself entirely to loving. It is in returning love that she responds to love. And even if she totally poured herself forth in love, this would be little in comparison with that ever-flowing torrent which is its source. For there is no comparison in the volume of flow of lover and love, of soul and word, of bride and bridegroom, of creator and creature, no more than there is a comparison between one who is thirsty and the running spring. For who can doubt that the soul is loved first by the Word, and to a greater extent? He both anticipates the soul in loving and excels it. Happy is the one who is thus anticipated by the blessing of such sweetness. Happy is the one to whom it is given to experience the great love which is holy and chaste, a love which is sweet and pleasant, a love characterized as much by serenity as by sincerity, a reciprocal love which is both strong and intimate, which joins two not into one flesh, but into one spirit, so that they are no longer two, but one. This is what Paul says in the text: he who adheres to God becomes one spirit with him.
More of the same, but the point that he makes is very strong with Bernard in De Diligendo Deo, that God prior dilexit nos, God loved us first, and that we will never love God until we learn to receive and acknowledge the love which we have received. And so the biggest problem that we have on a practical level is our own self-hatred, our own refusal to admit our intrinsic lovableness. We may hand out press releases to everybody and say we're very lovable, got all these characteristics, but often such an action is simply an expression of a deep doubt that we have about whether we are in fact lovable. And Bernard says we'll never love God. There's no possibility at all of loving God unless we are prepared to receive from him the gift of love, unless we are to find that we are loved by him. And so the first stage in the spiritual life, and probably the lifelong task of the contemplative life especially, is simply this: to go and sit in the sun, as it were, to go and allow ourselves to expose ourselves to the love of God. Because our love for him will automatically flow from that. If we're not exposed to the love of God, then we'll never love him back. If we're not exposed to human love and we don't know how lovable we are, then we won't even know what it means to say that God is love. If the abbot, or presumably the abbess, who's supposed to be the representative of God, hates us, then we'll probably take this as being that we're unlovable sort of people. And we'll try and justify ourselves and rationalize our life, but there'll be something very seriously wrong in that. If we get the idea that those who represent God, who seem to be images of God, hate us, then we certainly won't think that God will love us despite this. It's very difficult. So the love of the church, the love of the community, is a very important thing for us in our growth. And if a community, for example, with regard to juniors in particular, sort of is beaming towards them disapproval, the length of their hair, the shoes that they wear, the noise that they make, and all they get from the community is disapproval, well, eventually this will start to churn up all sorts of tendencies to self-recrimination inside them. They'll begin to doubt their lovableness, not only on a human level, but also with regard to God. And so, the whole thing is, first we must sit in the sun. First we must go out and allow ourselves to have the radiance of God's love beam in upon us. And that's why the role of prayer, the role of just learning to be content with a simple contemplative life is just so important for us to grow in the love of God and the practice of everything that's good. For who can doubt that the soul is both loved first by the Word and to a greater extent? God's love is always beaming in upon us, but we just have to start picking it up and we'll automatically reciprocate. It's not a work of human merit, but a work of grace. Perhaps the last word on this theme comes at the beginning of Sermon 83, where Bernard brings together so many of his favoured images to form a lyric celebration of hope in God's power to save, notwithstanding the many difficulties and reversals of fortune to which human life is prone. Because the soul has a permanent capacity to receive and to be restored by the gifts of grace, and because God is ever ready to give them, there can never be cause for doubt or desperation. So even us, we can say in our own regard that we can't even have the luxury of despair. And there is hope even for us. So let's read this famous text. I'll read it myself. And it's kind of a poetic text. It's an enormous long sentence. I kept the Latin sentence, but it goes most of that page. And it's an enormous sentence. But it's very, very tight. It's not a wobbly sentence, and furthermore, and somehow or other, but a very, very tight sentence. It is my teaching. Now, Bernard never says that. So this is a very solemn text. So he's putting it out. Listen, this is what I say. It is my teaching that every soul, although burdened with sins, although caught in a trap, although a captive in exile, although imprisoned in its body, although clinging to the mud and stuck in the mire, although afflicted with sorrows, made anxious by many worries and unsettled by suspicions, although it is a traveller in a hostile country and thus, as the prophet says, soiled by contact with the dead and reckoned with those in hell. This is what I say, that although a soul is so condemned and so desperate, nevertheless it is my teaching that such a soul is able to find within itself not only a source of relief in the hope of pardon, so that it may hopefully seek for mercy, but it will also find a source of boldness, that it may desire marriage with the Word, not fearing to enter into a treaty of friendship with God, nor being timid about taking up the yoke of love of the one who is the King of angels. For what cannot be safely dared when the soul sees itself as his excellent image and distinguished likeness? Very, very powerful text. Well, whatever situation you're in, no matter how low you've fallen, no matter how hopeless you are, burdened with sins, caught in a trap, captive in exile, imprisoned in the body, clinging to the mud and stuck in the mire. You can just hear him licking his lips with these images. It's very carefully constructed. You can see that even from the English translation. Afflicted with sorrows, made anxious by worries, unsettled by suspicions, and so forth. Nevertheless, if it only hopes for pardon for sin, then it's underrating God. It's not allowed simply to limit God's action in its regard to forgiveness, merely forgiving a sin. All right, go in peace. Next. But he's saying you don't only get your sins forgiven, but everything is still open to you. Everything. The whole goal of human life, although it may have taken 92 years to get there, the goal of human life is still there. It may desire marriage with the Word, and not only desire it diffidently, but with boldness, not fearing to enter into a treaty of friendship with God, nor being timid, like a little mouse, about taking up the yoke of love of the one who is the King of angels. It's a very, very strong text, that there is absolutely nothing that can prevent us from receiving the grace of God except our own unwillingness to receive it. And that can be changed, even though we get ourselves deeper and deeper into a mess. even though we make more and more chaos of our life, even though our life is more and more characterized by sin, and we ourselves are exposed to all our psychological weaknesses and every error that we've ever made in our own history. And we can see the fruits of this, but even so, he says, that hope is not only possible, but the hope is still there. It's as easy for you to make the whole distance and arrive as it is for somebody who has been a little angel all his or her life. And it's the whole thing because it's God's gift and because we always retain the potentiality to receive not only the grace of God, but God himself. For what cannot be safely dared when the soul sees itself as his excellent image and distinguished likeness. So tomorrow we'll go on and look at some of the practicalities of this experience. Today we've been talking about, you might say, theoretical basis, the frame of reference in which Bernard sees desire. Tomorrow we'll go and talk about the actual way in which the experience of a life of desire impinges on our consciousness.